the rain drummed against the window of Mark's office, each drop an echo of his disquiet. His workspace, usually a haven of precision and order, felt oppressive under the weight of suspicion. The day had started with an innocuous discovery, a misplaced receipt for a restaurant Mark didn't remember Sarah mentioning. It wasn't the receipt itself, but the careless handwriting of a man's name on the back, Jason, that pulled at a thread he hadn't known existed. By evening, Mark was driving home, his mind churning through fragments of their life together. He recalled Sarah's recent trips to the city for networking events and her sudden zeal for yoga retreats. These weren't unusual for someone in her field, but Mark's instincts, honed through years of detail-oriented engineering, told him to probe deeper. When he arrived home, the house greeted him with its usual warmth. Yet as he stepped into the living room, something felt different. Sarah was perched on the edge of the sofa, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the fabric. She looked up and smiled. Too brightly. "You're home early," she remarked, her tone light but forced. Mark set down his briefcase, his sharp eyes catching the faint scent of cologne that wasn't his. "Yeah, the meeting ended sooner than I thought." Sarah nodded, avoiding his gaze. "That's nice." "Dinner's almost ready." As they ate, Mark studied her. He noticed her glances toward her phone, the way she barely touched her food. The silence between them grew heavier, charged with the unspoken. Later that night, as Sarah retreated to bed, Mark stayed behind in his office. He opened his laptop and searched for the restaurant from the receipt. A few clicks revealed photos tagged on social media, and there she was, Sarah, sitting across from a younger man, laughing in a way Mark hadn't seen in years. Mark's chest tightened. He stared at the screen, anger mingling with despair. But instead of confronting Sarah immediately, he leaned back in his chair, his jaw set. If there was one thing Mark knew, it was how to construct a plan. As the storm raged outside, Mark began piecing together the evidence, the betrayals swirling around him like the rain against the window. Tomorrow he would act, not impulsively, but deliberately. The next morning, Mark woke early. The house was still quiet, save for the gentle hum of the coffee machine brewing in the kitchen. Sarah's absence from their bedroom was a small blessing. It gave him the space to breathe, to focus on the plan forming in his mind. Today would not be about confrontation, it would be about gathering the truth with clarity and precision. He sat at the dining table, his laptop open, reviewing Sarah's recent credit card statements. He cross-referenced the names of businesses and restaurants with her calendar entries. The inconsistencies were glaring. Lunch meeting with clients aligned with charges at an upscale cocktail lounge. A yoga retreat coincided with a booking at a boutique hotel 2 towns over. These registrations looked suggestive of a society-dead connection. Mark's professional instincts kicked in. His work as an engineer had always been about finding flaws in structures, the weak points that others missed. This situation, as deeply personal as it was, needed the same measured approach. Later that day, Mark called Emma, his closest confidant. Emma had been his best friend since college, her loyalty unwavering through the years. She answered on the first ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Hey Mark, what's up? I need your help," he said, his tone serious. "And I need you to promise me discretion." The 3 men nodded. Emma hesitated for only a moment. "Of course. What's going on?" Mark explained the situation as briefly as he could. By the time he finished, Emma was furious on his behalf. "She's been playing you," Emma said, her voice sharp. "You deserve better than this." Mark appreciated her anger, but he kept his voice even. "I don't want to jump to conclusions without solid evidence. I need you to help me track down more information. I have a name. Jason. I think he's the man Sarah's been seeing." Emma promised to help, and Mark knew she would follow through. As they ended the call, Mark felt a flicker of relief. He wasn't alone in this anymore. That evening he stayed late at work, deliberately avoiding going home too early. He needed time to think, to plan. On his desk, he spread out a map of their city, marking locations connected to Sarah's suspicious activities. Her pattern became clearer, a radius centered on a particular part of downtown, where Jason's name kept appearing. Back at home, Mark was greeted by Sarah's cheerful facade. She kissed him on the cheek, but her eyes betrayed nervous energy. "Long day?" she asked casually. Mark nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, you know how it is." As they sat together watching TV, Mark felt the weight of the unspoken truth between them. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. How many times had he dismissed these signs? How often had he told himself that her laughter was genuine, her excuses believable? But now, with every piece of evidence in his possession, he saw her differently. She wasn't the Sarah he had married. She was someone else entirely, a stranger wearing the mask of his wife. And soon, the mask would come off. The tension in the house grew palpable as Mark's investigation intensified. Each new piece of evidence sharpened the image of betrayal, but it also fueled his resolve. He was done being passive, done letting her lies pile up like bricks in a wall between them. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about reclaiming his dignity and his life. On Wednesday morning, Mark left for work as usual, but his briefcase carried more than blueprints. Inside were copies of Sarah's recent financial statements, social media prints, and a flash drive containing key emails he'd extracted from her cloud account. The evidence was damning: payments for luxury hotel stays under Jason's name, text messages full of thinly veiled flirtations, and even a reservation for a private boat tour on the weekend Mark had been away for a conference. Except for a trip to a pavilion, the weekend Mark had been a desolate. At lunchtime, he met with Emma at a quiet cafe near her office. She arrived with her own findings, a folder of photographs and documents she had obtained through a private investigator friend. "Here's what I've got," Emma said, sliding the folder across the table. Mark opened it, his hands steady despite the turmoil inside. "They've been meeting regularly," Emma said quietly. "At least twice a week for the past 3 months. It's not just casual." Mark swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the truth settle in his chest. "Thank you, Emma," he said, his voice hoarse. Emma reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You don't have to go through this alone, Mark. Whatever you decide to do, I've got your back." Back at work, Mark locked himself in his office and opened his laptop. He scrolled through the photos again, memorizing the details, the dates, the locations, the expressions on Sarah's face. It was clear she wasn't just indulging in a fling. She had built an alternate life with Jason, one that she carefully shielded from Mark's view. That evening, Mark came home to find Sarah in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She turned and greeted him with a warm smile, as though nothing was amiss. The sight of her, so familiar yet so deceptive, filled him with a mix of anger and sadness. "I made your favorite," she said, gesturing to the table where a perfectly plated meal awaited. Mark forced a smile and sat down, the weight of his knowledge pressing heavily on his chest. As Sarah chatted about her day, he studied her closely, searching for cracks in her facade. She seemed so convincing, so genuine, that for a moment Mark wondered how he had ever seen through her. But he had seen through her, and now there was no turning back. The confrontation was inevitable. It was only a matter of time. And when the moment came, Mark would be ready. Friday evening arrived, and the storm brewing inside Mark was ready to break. He had spent the day meticulously planning the confrontation, running through every possible scenario. He wasn't going to raise his voice or let his emotions take control. This wasn't about catharsis. It was about clarity and reclaiming his life. Mark came home earlier than usual, the setting sun casting long shadows across the walls of their townhouse. Sarah was in the living room, scrolling through her phone with a glass of wine beside her. She looked up, startled to see him. "You look well?" she asked, miracle cueing. "You're home early?" she said with a nervous smile. "I thought it was time we had a talk," Mark replied, his voice calm but firm. Sarah's smile faltered. "Sure," she said, setting her phone down. "What's on your mind?" Mark walked to the bookshelf and pulled out the leather-bound journal he had discovered earlier that week. He placed it on the coffee table between them, its weight symbolic of the truth it held. "Wait," Dexter said. "I found this while organizing my office," he began, watching her face. "It's your diary." Sarah's expression shifted instantly, her eyes widening in alarm, before she quickly masked it with a feigned nonchalance. "That's private," she said, reaching for it, but Mark's hand covered the journal. Mark extended his hand. "Private?" he asked, his tone measured. "It stopped being private the moment you started writing about the lies and deceit." Her hand froze, and for a moment they sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. "I know about Jason," Mark said finally, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. Sarah's lips parted as if to deny it, but no words came out. Instead, she leaned back, her face pale. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Hmm?" said Carlo. "Then tell me what it is," Mark demanded, his eyes never leaving hers. She hesitated, tears pooling in her eyes. "It just happened," she said finally. "I never meant to hurt you, Mark. You have to believe me." Mark shook his head, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You didn't just hurt me. You broke the foundation of everything we built together. And for what? A fantasy. A thrill." Sarah's tears began to fall, but Mark didn't flinch. "I thought we were happy," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought we were building a life together, a future. But you've been building something else, haven't you? With him." Sarah covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "I didn't know how to stop," she said between gasps. "I didn't know how to fix it." Mark stood, his heart heavy but resolute. "You didn't try to fix it," he said. "You chose lies over truth, betrayal over trust, and now you have to live with the consequences." Chauvin managed a bowed, glancing at the princess, who was still crouched beside her friend. She clung to her leg. He picked up the journal and walked toward the door. "I'll be staying somewhere else tonight," he said. "When I come back, we'll discuss the next steps. But know this, Sarah. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed yourself." Her hand cupped his face and her lips quivered. The door closed behind him, leaving Sarah alone with her guilt and the broken pieces of their life together. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the hotel room where Mark had spent the night. It was a modest, quiet place, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed his thoughts. The weight of the confrontation lingered, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of relief. He had spoken his truth, laid bare the betrayal, and now he was ready to begin the process of moving forward, alone if necessary. Mark reached for his phone, scrolling through messages from Emma, who had checked on him late into the night. She had reassured him that he was stronger than he realized, and that he didn't need to make any decisions right away. For now, Mark's focus was on clarity and control. Back at the house, Sarah sat in the living room, the journal still on the coffee table where Mark had left it. The silence in the home was deafening, the absence of Mark's steady presence like a void she couldn't ignore. She had replayed their conversation over and over, her sobs echoing into the early hours. For the first time, she faced the full weight of her actions, the consequences she had thought she could avoid. Mark returned that evening, his demeanor composed but distant. Sarah looked up from the couch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Mark," she said softly, standing as he entered the room. "I," he replied, standing as he entered the room. He raised a hand to stop her. "I'm not here for apologies or explanations," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to set boundaries." Sarah nodded, her face crumbling under the strain of her emotions. "I've spoken to a lawyer," Mark began, sitting at the dining table. "We'll be starting the divorce process. I'll make sure it's as fair as possible, but I won't be staying in this house while we figure things out." Sarah's tears began again, but Mark didn't waver. "You need to think about what you want," he continued. "Not just for yourself, but for the person you've become. I won't carry the weight of your decisions anymore." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Mark stood, gathering a few belongings he had left behind, and prepared to leave. As he reached the door, Sarah spoke, her voice trembling. Has no one talked about the medicine's value? She asked, still trying to stay on track. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? She asked. Mark paused, his hand on the doorknob. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Forgiveness isn't something I can promise, he said. It's something that has to come in its own time, if it comes at all. Without another word, he left, stepping into the crisp evening air. The night felt different, freer somehow, as if he had finally stepped out from under a shadow. In the weeks that followed, Mark focused on rebuilding his life. He leaned on Emma's support, poured himself into his work, and rediscovered parts of himself he had long neglected. Slowly, piece by piece, he started to heal. Sarah, meanwhile, grappled with the wreckage of her choices. Friends she had once counted on turned their backs as the truth of her actions spread. The life she had built with Jason crumbled before it began, leaving her to face the stark reality of her loneliness. By the end of it all, Mark found peace, not in revenge or retribution, but in the understanding that he could rebuild, stronger and more deliberate than before. And for Sarah, the silence of an empty house served as a constant reminder of what she had lost.